Hi, y'all. We're going to continue to read and number the stars, and this is chapter 11. And we know that when we left off, that it kind of got to a really exciting part yesterday where Peter had come over after reading the Bible. He opened the lid of the casket. And so this is where we're starting today, and it's on page 88. We're going to read chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 today. And this is called Will We See You Again Soon, Peter? Starting on page 88. Anne Marie blinked. Across the dark room, she saw Ellen too, peering into the narrow wooden box in surprise. There was no one in the casket at all. Instead, it seemed to be stuffed with folded blankets and articles of clothing. Peter began to lift the things out and distribute them to the silent people in the room. He handed heavy coats to the man and wife and another to the old man with the beard. It will be very cold, he murmured. Put them on. He found a thick sweater for Mrs. Rosen and a woolen jacket for Ellen's father, and after a moment of rummaging through the folded things, he found a winter jacket and handed it to Ellen. Anne Marie watched as Ellen took the jacket in her arms and looked at it. It was patched and worn. It was true that there had been few new clothes for anyone during the recent years, but still Ellen's mother had always managed to make clothes for her daughter, often using old things that she was able to take apart and refashion in a way that made them seem brand new. Never had Ellen worn anything so shabby and old, but she put it on, pulled it around her, and buttoned the mismatched buttons. Peter, his arms full of odd pieces of clothing, looked toward the silent couple with the infant. I'm sorry, he said to them, but there is nothing for a baby. I'll find something, Mama said quickly. The baby must be warm. She left the room and was back in a moment with Kirsty's thick red sweater. Here, she said softly to the mother. It will be much too big, but that will make it even warmer for him. The woman spoke for the first time. Her, she whispered. She's a girl. Her name is Rachel. Mama smiled and helped her direct the sleeping baby's arms into the sleeves of the sweater. Together they buttoned the heart-shaped buttons. How Kirsty loved that sweater with its heart buttons, until the tiny child was completely encased in the warm red wool. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Peter reached into his pocket and took something out and went to the parrots and leaned down toward the baby. He opened the lid of the small bottle in his hand. How much does she weigh? Peter asked. She was 7 pounds when she was born, the young woman replied. She's gained a little, but not very much. Maybe she weighs 8 pounds now, no more. A few drops will be enough then. It has no taste. She won't even notice. The mother tightened her arms around the baby and looked up at Peter, pleading. Please, no, she said. She always sleeps all night. Please, she doesn't need it. I promise she won't cry. Peter's voice was firm. We can't take that chance, he said. He inserted the dropper of the bottle into the baby's tiny mouth and squeezed a few drops of liquid onto her tongue. The baby yawned and swallowed, and the mother closed her eyes and her husband gripped her shoulder. Next, Peter removed the folded blankets from the coffin one by one and handed them around. Carry these with you, he said. You will need them later for warmth. Anne Marie, the mother, moved around the room and gave each person a small package of food, the cheese and bread and apples that Anne Marie had helped her prepare in the kitchen hours before. Finally, Peter took a paper-wrapped packet from inside his own jacket. He looked around the room at the assembled people now dressed in the bulky winter clothing, and then motioned to Mr. Rosen, who followed him into the hall. Anne Marie could overhear the conversation. Mr. Rosen, Peter said, I must get this in Henrik, but I might not see him. I'm going to take the others only to the harbor, and they will go to the boat alone. I want you to deliver this without fail. It is of great importance. There was a moment of silence in the hall, and Anne Marie knew that Peter must be giving the packet to Mr. Rosen. Anne Marie could see it protruding from Mr. Rosen's pocket when she returned to the room and sat down again. She could see, too, that Mr. Rosen had a puzzled look. He didn't know what the packet contained. He hadn't asked. It was one more time Anne Marie realized when they had protected one another by not telling. If Mr. Rosen knew, he might be frightened. If Mr. Rosen knew, he might be in danger. So he hadn't asked, and Peter hadn't explained. Now, Peter said, looking at his watch, I will lead the first group. You and you and you. He gestured to the old man and to the young people with their baby. And, she said, Anne Marie realized that it was the first time that she had heard Peter Nilsson call her mother by her first name. Before, it had always been Mrs. Johansson, or in the old days during the merriment and excitement of his engagement to Lisa, it had been occasionally Mama, and now it was Inge. It was as if he had moved beyond his own youth and taken his place in the world of adults. Her mother nodded and waited for his instructions. You wait 20 minutes and then bring the Rosens. Don't come sooner. We must be separate on the path so there is less chance of being seen. Mrs. Johansson nodded again. Come directly back to the house after you have seen the Rosens safely to Henrik. Stay in the shadows and on the back path. You know that, of course. But by the time you get the Rosens to the boat, Peter went on, I will be gone. As soon as I deliver my group, I must move on. There is other work to be done tonight. He turned to Anne-Marie. So I will say goodbye to you now. Anne-Marie went to him and gave him a hug. But will we see you again soon, she asked. I hope so, Peter said, very soon. Don't grow much more. You will be taller than I am, little long legs. Anne-Marie smiled, but Peter's comment was no longer the light-hearted fun of the past. It was only a brief gasp at something that had gone. Peter kissed Mama wordlessly, and then he wished the Rosens Godspeed, and he left the others through the door. Mama, Anne-Marie, and the Rosens sat in silence. There was a slight commotion outside the door, and Mama went quickly to look out. In a moment, she was back. It's all right, she said in response to their looks. The old man stumbled, but Peter helped him up. He didn't seem to be hurt, maybe just his pride, she added, smiling a bit. It was an odd word, pride. Anne-Marie looked at the Rosens sitting there wearing the misshapen, ill-fitting clothing, holding ragged blankets folded in their arms, their faces drawn and tired. She remembered the earlier happy times, Mrs. Rosen, her hair neatly combed and covered, lighting the Sabbath candles, saying the ancient prayer. And Mr. Rosen, sitting in the big chair in their living room, studying his thick books, correcting papers, adjusting his glasses, looking up now and then to complain good-naturedly about the lack of decent light. She remembered Ellen in the school play, moving confidently across the stage, her gestures sure and her voice clear. All these things, these sources of pride, the candlesticks, the books, the daydreams of theater, had been left behind in Copenhagen. They had nothing more with them now. There was only the clothing of unknown people for warmth, the food from Henrik's farm for survival, and the dark path ahead through the woods to freedom. Anne-Marie realized, though, that she had not really been told that Uncle Henrik was going to take them in his boat across the sea to Sweden. She knew how frightened Mrs. Rosen was of the sea, its width, its depth, its cold. She knew how frightened Ellen was of the soldiers with their guns and boots who were certainly looking for them. And she knew how frightened they all must be of the future. But their shoulders were as straight as they had been in the past, in the classroom, on the stage, at the Sabbath table. So there were other sources, too, of pride, and they had not left everything behind. This chapter is number 12, and it's called Where is Mama? Mr. Rosen tripped on the loose step outside the kitchen door. His wife grasped his arm, and he regained his balance. It's very dark, Mama whispered as they stood in the yard with their blankets and bundle of food gathered in their arms, and we can't use any kind of light. I'll go first. I know the way very well, and you follow me. Try not to stumble over the tree roots on the path. Feel carefully with your feet. The path is uneven. And be very, very quiet, she added unnecessarily. The night was quiet too. A slight breeze moved in the tops of the trees, and from across the meadow came the sound of the sea's movement, which was a constant sound here and always had been. No birds called or cried here now in the night. The cow slept silently in the barn, the kitten upstairs in Kirsty's arms. There were stars here and there dotting the sky among the thin clouds, but no moon. Anne-Marie shivered, standing at the foot of the steps. Come, Mama murmured, and she moved away from the house. One by one, the Rosens turned and hugged Anne-Marie silently. Ellen came to her last, and the two girls held each other. I'll come back someday, Ellen whispered fiercely. I promise. I know you will, Anne-Marie whispered back, holding her friend tightly. Then they were gone, Mama and the Rosens. Anne-Marie was alone. She went into the house, crying suddenly, and closed the door against the night. The lid of the casket was closed again, and now the room was empty. There was no sign of the people who had sat there for hours. Anne-Marie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and she opened the dark curtains in the windows. She curled once more in the rocker, trying to relax, and she traced their route in her mind. She knew the old path, too, not as well as her mother, who had followed her almost every day of her childhood with her dog scampering behind. But Anne-Marie had often walked to town and back that way, and she remembered the turns, the twisted trees whose gnarled roots pushed the earth now and then into knotted clumps, and the thick bushes that often flowered in early summer. She walked with them in her mind, feeling the way through the darkness. It would take them, she thought, half an hour to reach the place where Uncle Henrik was waiting with his boat. Mama would leave them there, pausing a minute, no more, for final hug, and then she would turn and come home. It would be faster for Mama alone, with no need to wait as the Rosens, unfamiliar with the path, slowly felt their way along. Mama could hurry, sure-footed now, back to her children. The clock in the hall struck once. It was 2:30 in the morning. Her mother would be home in an hour, Anne-Marie decided. She rocked gently back and forth in the old chair. Mama would be home by 3:30. She thought of Papa back in Copenhagen alone. He would be awake too. He would be wishing he would have come, but knowing too that he must come and go as always, to the corner store for his newspaper, to his office when morning came. And now he would be afraid for them and watch the clock, waiting for word that the Rosens were safe, that Mama and the girls were here at the farm, starting a new day with the sun shining through the kitchen window and cream on their oatmeal. It was harder for the ones who were waiting, Anne-Marie knew. Less danger, perhaps, but more fear. She yawned and her head nodded. She fell asleep, and it was a sleep as thin as the night clouds, dotted with dreams that came and went like the stars. Light woke her, but it was not really morning, not yet. It was only the first hint of a slightly lightening sky, a pale gleam at the edge of the meadow, a sign that far away somewhere to the east where Sweden still slept, morning would be coming soon. Dawn would creep across the Swedish farmland and coast, and then it would wash little Denmark with light and move across the North Sea to wake Norway. Anne-Marie blinked in confusion, sitting up, remembering after a moment where she was and why. But it was not right. The pale light at the horizon. It should be dark still. It should still be night. She stood stiffly, stretching her legs, and went to the hall to look at the old clock. It was past 4 o'clock. Where was Mama? Perhaps she had come home, not wanted to wake Anne-Marie, and had gone to bed herself. Surely that was it. Mama must have been exhausted. She'd been up all night and made the dangerous journey to the boat and returned through the dark woods, wanting only to sleep. Quickly, Anne-Marie went up the narrow staircase. The door to the bedroom where she had slept with Ellen was open. The 2 small beds were neatly made, covered with the old quilts, and empty. Beside it, Uncle Henrik's door was open too, and his bed too was unused and empty. Despite her worry, Anne-Marie smiled slightly as she saw some of Henrik's clothes crumpled on a chair and a pair of shoes caked with barnyard dirt lying on the floor. He needs a wife, she said to herself, imitating Mama. The door to the other bedroom, the one Kirsty and Mama were sharing, was closed. Quietly, not wanting to wake them, Anne-Marie pushed it open. The kitten's ears moved, standing up straight, its eyes opened wide, and it raised its head and yawned. It pried itself out of Kirsty's arm, stretched, and then jumped lightly to the floor and came to Anne-Marie. It rubbed itself against her leg and purred. Kirsty sighed and turned in her sleep, one arm free now of the kitten's warmth and comfort, flung itself across the pillow. There was no one else in the wide bed. Anne-Marie moved quickly to the window which overlooked the clearing that led to the path's entrance. The light outside was still very dim, and she peered through the dimness, trying to see, looking for the opening in the trees where the path began, looking for Mama hurrying home. After a second, she saw a shape there, something unfamiliar, something that had not been there the day before. A dark shape, no more than a blurred heap at the beginning of the path. Anne-Marie squinted, forcing her eyes to understand, needing to understand, not wanting to understand. The shape moved, and she knew it was her mother lying on the earth. Run as fast as you can. This is the chapter 13. Still moving quietly so as not to wake her sister, Anne-Marie sped down the stairs and through the kitchen door. Her foot caught the loose step, and she faltered for a moment, righting herself, and then dashed across the ground to the place where her mother lay. Mama, she called desperately. Mama. Shh, said Mama, raising her head. I'm all right. But Mama, Anne-Marie asked, kneeling beside her, what's wrong? What happened? Her mother pulled herself to a sitting position. She winced in pain. I'm all right, really. Don't worry. And the Rosens are with Henrik. That's the important thing. She smiled a little, though her face was drawn with pain, and she bit her lip, the smile fading. We got there quite quickly, even though it was still dark, and it was difficult for the Rosens not knowing the path. Henrik was there waiting on the boat, and he took them aboard and down below so quickly to the cabin that they were invisible in an instant. He said the others were already there. Peter got them there safely too. So I turned and hurried home. I was so anxious to get back to you girls. I should have been more careful. Talking softly, she brushed some grass and dirt from her hands. Can you believe it? I was nearly here, well, maybe just halfway, when I tripped over a root and went sprawling. Mama sighed. So clumsy, she said, as if she were scolding herself. I'm afraid my ankle is broken, Anne Marie. Thank goodness it is nothing worse. An ankle mends, and I am home, and the Rosens are with Henrik. You should have seen me, Anne Marie, she said, shaking her head with a wry look. Your proper mamma, crawling inch by inch. I probably looked like a drunkard. She reached for Anne Marie's arm. Here, let me lean on you. I think if you support me on this side, I can make my way up to the house. Goodness, what a clumsy fool I am. Here, let me put my arm over your shoulders. You're such a good, strong, brave girl. Now, very slowly. There. Mama's face was white with pain, and Anne Marie could see that even though through a faint light of approaching dawn. She hobbled, leaning heavily on her daughter, pausing again and again toward the house. When we get inside, I'll have a cup of tea, and then we'll call the doctor. I'll tell him that I fell on the stairs. You'll have to help me wash away the grass and twigs. Here, Anne Marie, let me rest for a minute. When they had reached the house and Mama sank down into the steps and sat, she took several deep breaths. Anne Marie sat beside her and held her hand. Mama, I was so worried when you didn't come back. Mama nodded. I knew you would be. I thought of you worrying as I dragged myself along, but here I am, safe with you. Everything is fine. What time is it? It must be 4:30 or close to it. They will sail soon. Mama turned her head and gazed across the meadow to the sea, the vast sky above it. There were no stars now, only the gray, pale sky with pinkness at its border. Soon they will be safe, too. Anne Marie relaxed. She stroked her mother's hand and looked down at the discolored, swollen ankle. Mama, what is this? She asked suddenly, reaching into the grass at the foot of the steps. Mama looked and gasped. Oh my God, she said. Anne Marie picked it up. She recognized it now and knew what it was. It was the packet that Peter had given to Mr. Rosen. Mr. Rosen tripped on the step, remember? It must have fallen from his pocket. We'll have to save it and give it back to Peter. Anne Marie handed it to your mother. Do you know what it is? Her mother didn't answer. Her face was stricken. She looked at the path and down at her ankle. It's important, isn't it, Mama? It was for Uncle Henrik. I remember Peter said it was very important. I heard him tell Mr. Rosen. Her mother tried to stand but fell back against the steps with a groan. Oh, no, she murmured again. It may have all been for nothing. Anne Marie took the packet from her mother's hand and stood. I will take it, she said. I know the way, and it's almost light now. I can run like the wind. Mama spoke quickly, her voice tense. Anne Marie, go into the house and get the small basket on the table. Quickly, quickly. Put an apple into it and some cheese and put this packet underneath. Do you understand? Hurry. Anne Marie did instantly as she was told. The basket, the packet at the bottom. She covered it with a napkin and then some wrapped cheese and an apple. She glanced around the kitchen, saw some bread, and added that. The little basket was full, and she took it to where her mother was. You must run to the boat. If anyone should stop you, who would stop me? Anne Marie, you understand how dangerous this is. If any soldiers see you, if they stop you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a little girl, a silly, empty-handed little girl taking lunch to a fisherman, a foolish uncle who forgot his bread and cheese. Mama, what is that? What is it in the bottom? But her mother still didn't answer the question. Go, she said firmly. Go right now and run as fast as you can. Anne Marie kissed her mother quickly, grabbed the basket from her mother's lap, and turned and ran toward the path. This is chapter 14, On the Dark Path. Only now, entering the woods on the footpath, did Anne Marie realize how cold the dawn was. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned sweaters, jackets, and coats, and she had peered into the night, following them with her eyes as they moved silently off, bulky in their garments, blankets in their arms. But she wore only a light sweater over her cotton dress. Though the October day later would be warmed by sunlight, now it was gray, chilly, and damp, and she shivered. The path curved, and she could no longer look behind her and see the clearing with the farmhouse outlined against the pale sky and the lightning meadow beyond. Now there were only the dark woods ahead, underfoot. The path, latticed with thick roots hidden under fallen leaves, was invisible. She felt her way with her feet, trying not to stumble. The handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through the sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had often told Kirsty as they cuddled at night in bed. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. Her mother had made it for her. She wore it so often that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. She would always interrupt there, or Kirsty would always interrupt there. Why is it they called her Red Riding Hood? Kirsty would ask. Why didn't they call her just Little Red Cloak? Well, it had a hood that covered her head. She had beautiful curls like you, Kirsty. Maybe someday Mama will make you a coat with a hood to cover your curls and keep you warm. But why, Kirsty would ask, was it a riding hood? Was she riding a horse? Maybe she had a horse that she rode sometimes, but not in this story. Now stop interrupting every minute. Anne-Marie smiled, feeling her way through the dark, remembering how Kirsty always interrupted stories to ask questions. Often she just wanted to make the story last longer. The story continued. One day the little girl's mother said, I want you to take a basket of food to your grandmother. She's sick in bed. Come, let me tie your red cloak. The grandmother lived deep in the woods, didn't she? Kirsty would ask. Is it dangerous woods where wolves lived? Anne-Marie heard a small noise, a squirrel perhaps, a rabbit scampering by. She paused, stood still on the path, and smiled again. Kirsty would have been frightened. She would have grabbed Anne-Marie's hand and said, a wolf. But Anne-Marie knew that these woods were not like the woods in the story. There were no wolves or bears or tigers and none of the beasts that populated Kirsty's vivid imagination. She hurried on. Still, they were very dark, these woods. Anne-Marie had never followed this path in the dark before. She had told her mother she would run, and she tried. Here the path turned. She knew the turning well, though it seemed different in the dark. If she turned to the left, it would take her to the road, out where it would be lighter, wider, more traveled, but more dangerous too. Someone would see her on the road. At this time of dawn, other fishermen would be on the road, hurrying to their boats for the long day at sea, and there might be soldiers. She turned to the right and headed deeper into the woods. It was why Mama and Peter had needed to guide those who were strangers here, the Rosens and the others. A wrong turn would have taken them into danger. So Little Red Riding Hood carried the basket of food and hurried along through the woods. It was a lovely morning and the birds were singing. Little Red Riding Hood sang too as she walked. Sometimes she changed that part of the story, telling it to Kirsty. Sometimes it was raining or even snowing in the woods. Sometimes it was evening with long, frightening shadows, so that Kirsty, listening, would snuggle closer and wrap her arms around Anne-Marie. But now, telling it to herself, she wanted sunlight and birdsong. Here the path widened and flattened, and it was the place where the woods opened on one side and the path curved below the meadow at the edge of the sea. Here she could run, and she did. Here in daylight, there would be cows in the meadow, and on summer afternoons, Anne-Marie could always stop by the fence and hold out a handful of grass, which the curious cows would take with their rough tongues. Here, her mother had told her, Mama would always stop too as a child walking to school. Her dog, Trofast, would wiggle under the fence and run about the meadow, barking excitedly, trying to chase the cows who always ignored him. The meadow was empty now, and the colorless in the half light. She could hear the churning sea beyond, and she could see the wash of daylight to the east over Sweden. She ran as fast as she could, searching with her eyes for the place ahead where the path would re-enter the woods, its final segment, which led to town. Here, the bushes were overgrown, and it was difficult to see the path here. She found the entrance beside the high blueberry bushes. How often she had stopped here in late summer to pick a handful of sweet berries. Her hands and mouth would be blue afterward, and Mama always laughed when she came home. Now it was dark again as the trees and the bushes closed around her. She had to move more slowly, though she still tried to run. Anne-Marie thought of Mama, her ankle so swollen and her face so pained. She hoped Mama had called the doctor by now. The local doctor was an old man, brusque and businesslike, though with kind eyes. He had come to the farmhouse several times during the summers in the past, his battered car noisy on the dirt road. He had come once when Kirsty, a tiny baby then, had been sick and wailing with an earache. And he had come when Lisa had spilled hot grease cooking breakfast and burned her hand. Anne-Marie turned again as the path divided once more. The left fork would take her directly to the village. It was the way they had come from the train and the way Mama had walked to school as a girl. But Anne-Marie turned to the right, heading now toward the harbor side where the fishing boats lay at anchor. She had often come this way before, too, sometimes at the end of the afternoon to pick out the Ingeborg, Uncle Enric's boat, but from many returning and to watch him and his helpers unload the day's catch of slippery, shimmering herring still flopping in their containers. Even now, with the boats in the harbor ahead, empty of fish, preparing to leave for the day's fishing, she could smell the oily, salty scent of herring, which always remained in the air here. It wasn't far now, and it was getting lighter, and she ran almost as fast as she had run at school in the Friday foot races. almost as fast as she had run down the Copenhagen sidewalk on the day that the soldier had stopped her with his call of halt. Anne-Marie continued the story in her head. Suddenly, Little Red Riding Hood walked through the woods. She heard a noise, and she heard rustling in the bushes. A wolf, Christy would always say, shivering with fearful delight. I know it's going to be a wolf. Anne-Marie always tried to prolong this part to build up the suspense and tantalize her sister. She didn't know what it was. She stopped on the path and listened. Something was following her in the bushes. Little Red Riding Hood was very, very, very frightened. She would stop. She would stay silent for a moment, and beside her in the bed, she could feel Kirsty holding her breath. Then Anne-Marie would go on in a low, dread-filled voice. She heard a growl. Anne-Marie stopped suddenly and stood still on the path. There was a turn immediately ahead. Beyond it, she knew as soon as she rounded the turn, she would see the landscape open to the sea. The woods would be behind her there, and ahead of her would be the harbor, the docks, and the countless fishing boats. And very soon it would be noisy there with engines starting, firemen calling to one another, and gulls crying. But she had heard something else. She had heard bushes rustling ahead. She heard footsteps, and she was certain it was not her imagination. She heard a low growl. Cautiously, she took a step forward and another. She approached the turn in the path, and the noises continued. And then they were there, in front of her, 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glittering and their lips curled. And we'll stop right here for today, and tomorrow we will finish the book. So I hope you have a great Thursday.